So far in this series, we've covered how to model or create geometry using primitives, generators, and deformers. Let's continue exploring what deformers we have at our disposal inside of Cinema 4D and create some wavy seaweed to help populate the inside of our bowl here. So let's start out with some base geometry. Let's go over to our primitives menu and let's select a capsule. And if I go and just move this around and adjust the handles here, again, you want to make sure you're in your model mode here. If you were in any of these other modes like point, edge, or polygon, you would not see those dots that will adjust the radius and height of our capsule. So just make sure you're in your model mode and you can adjust the dots here, kind of put this in place. And you can see that this is a little bit of a hassle because we have all of these objects kind of overlapping the geometry in our scene, kind of cluttering up our scene. And it's hard to say if I clicked off this and if I tried to click that capsule again, I wouldn't be able to select that capsule because my fishbowl is in the way. Now there is a way to actually select objects behind geometry, and that's using a modifier key. And if I hold the control key down and right click, you're gonna see that whatever is under my cursor, I can now select whatever object that is. So I've been selecting this topmost object, but if I want to select the capsule, what I'm going to do is release my control key and just select the capsule. And that way I can select objects behind the visible objects in my scene here. If I were to control and right click here, you'll see that under my cursor is not only the fishbowl in the capsule, but that right claw geometry. So that's a nice easy way to select objects that might be overlapped by objects in front of it. But a better way to isolate objects you want to work with is using the solo features inside of Cinema 4D. So let's just say we didn't need the crab visible. We didn't need the bowl visible. Really the only thing we need to place some of these seaweed elements is the sand and the seaweed object itself. So all I need is the capsule, the seaweed, and the sand. So if I hold the control key down and add to my selection here by selecting this sand lathe object, and if I wanted to solo just these two objects, what I can do is come over this icon here, and if you look on the lower left, you'll see that this icon is the Isolate Selected Objects in Viewport button. And you'll see this is actually called the Viewport Solo. So if I click that button, you're going to see that we're only going to see those objects we had selected, isolated, or soloed in our viewport. So now I can easily move this around. I can maybe go to the coordinates tab here, maybe shrink this down on the Z, maybe go 0.4. And now you can see we kind of flattened that out a little bit. But you can see that still doesn't look like seaweed too much. Now, one thing we can do to help us imagine this being seaweed is to just simply double click on the capsule and just type in seaweed, but that's a name only, right? How I would typically envision seaweed is we'd have a little bit of waviness to it. And luckily there's a deformer that will allow us to add wavy deformations to geometry. If we go into our deformer menu here and go all the way to the bottom, you're going to see there is this wind deformer and the icon for it's like a flag. Now a lot of these deformers will give you hints by the shape of their icon as to what they do and what kind of deformations they apply. And the wind deformer is going to allow us to create like a nice wavy undulating deformation. So if I go and I have my seaweed selected, remember we can hold the shift key down and release our mouse, and that will automatically apply the object we just added to the scene as a child of the selected object that we just had there. And this will also align the axis center of the deformer to the actual object we had as the parent. So you can see our wind deformer here, and you can see these two dots. Now, if I go to my wind deformer and go to the object tab, you can see the object properties. And as I adjust, say, the amplitude here, you can see that it's adjusting this dot. And this dot here, this yellow dot here, is adjusting the size. Now, if I shrink the size down enough, let's actually go and hit F5 to go to our top view. And you can see this nice wavy deformation, but it's not in the direction that we want. We actually want our waviness to be more like an S shape like this. So all we need to do is basically figure out how we can adjust the rotation of this deformation to have that S shape. So if I hit the R key to get to my rotation tool and highlight the Z-axis band here and and highlight the Z-axis here and hold the shift key down to rotate in increments of 5 degrees and just make this go to -90. And to make sure that we actually did go to -90, I'm going to go select the wind deformer, go to coordinates, and you can see I didn't quite get to -90, so I'll just manually type that in, -90, and hit enter. And you can see that this is still not in the right direction. We have this S shape, but going in the wrong axis. So I'll select the wind deformer again. And this time, let's rotate this along the Y-axis. Again, hold the shift key down to rotate in increments of 5 degrees. And I'll release my mouse. You can see -90 in the rotation heading and the banking. And now I can adjust these handles. And you can see that, okay, this is more what we're talking about here. Now you can see we're really chunky here. And if I hit N and B, you can see even in our other views here that we just don't have enough polygons, enough subdivisions to make nice smooth deformation. You can see how dense the mesh is of our sand and how low poly our seaweed is. So let's go to our capsule object here, aka our seaweed, and let's just adjust the height segments here and the cap segments. So the cap segments are the segments on the cap of the capsule, and the height segments are the amount of segments between the two caps here. So we'll adjust that, and that's looking pretty good. Let's hit N and then A to get back to garage shading with lines. And let's maximize our perspective view. And now we can kind of go into our wind deformer and adjust those properties here. Now, as I click on the wind deformer and go into the wind deformer object properties, you're going to see that we have this flag option checked. If I turn this off, you can see that there is going to be this nice waviness. And if I turn on the flag, you'll see that if we move this anchor point down, let's actually go to our 4-up view again. You can see that this flag option allows you to almost anchor down a part of your object and have the deformation progressively get stronger and stronger. So it's more like a flag versus a nice even deformation here. But what I want to do is I'll stick with the flag option here because I want to anchor my seaweed. And I'll just simply adjust the size here and the amplitude. So I just want a subtle amount of amplitude here. Maybe shrink down the size. Let's call this 20 centimeters. And for the amplitude, let's just do about 0.5 or maybe 0.4. Now you're seeing all types of like random undulation, and that's due to this turbulence option. I'm just going to turn this all the way down so we don't have any type of turbulence at all. And the cool thing about the wind deformer is that it actually has built-in animated properties. So you can see that we haven't really dealt with animation thus far, but you'll notice down here we have this play bar with like our play button, backwards forward button. And if I hit the play button or hit F8, you'll see that if I click on this perspective view, this will actually play the animation in this perspective view that I have activated. And let's actually maximize this again. You'll see that this has this nice undulation without any keyframes whatsoever. Now you might be wondering what's controlling the speed in which this is undulating. Well, it's this frequency option. If I crank up the frequency to 10, you can see that actually over 90 frames, we have a perfect loop. But what if we want to make this slower? What we can do is actually just divide this number by the amount of seconds we have here. So by default, our project is 30 frames per second. So if I just divide 10 and just hit /3, what this is going to do, and the cool thing about all of these little properties is Cinema 4D will do the math for you. So if you want to divide 10 by 3, just put 10/3 and hit enter. And for people that are terrible at math, like myself, Cinema 4D will do the math for you. And now we have this much slower, third slower bit of undulating animation. And you can see that this is going to perfectly loop every 90 frames. So I'll hit escape to pause that playback in the viewport there. And the one thing I want to do to this piece of seaweed, it's a little too chunky. Maybe you like this kind of thick, chunky type of seaweed, but I want to taper it at the top. So what I'll do is let's go ahead and grab a taper deformer, and let's just make this a child of the seaweed. And we have to remember the order of operations, right? We want to taper our object first and then add the wind deformer to the result. So this is exactly how we want this hierarchy to occur. And if I want this taper object to snap to the bounding box of our capsule, we'll just go and hit fits apparent. And then I just need to simply adjust this strength here. Okay, and you can see that now we got this really nice bit of seaweed that has a little bit of taper to it. You can always adjust to maybe make this a little bit thicker by adjusting this curvature. You can always go above the 300% by just continuing to adjust and scrub this value. Or we can maybe see what this looks like if we remove the curvature altogether. So you have a lot of control here. I'll just right click on the left or right arrows here to snap that back to its default value. And I'd say this is looking really nice. Now what we could do is let's make a bunch more of the seaweed. So what I'm going to do is Command or Control click and drag to duplicate that seaweed object. And I'll just move this. I'll shrink down the size and the radius of the capsule just by adjusting these little dots here. And let's kind of orbit around here. Let's move this back in Z space and let's duplicate this again. So Command or Control, click and drag. Let's move this here. Maybe make this a little thicker, a little longer. Maybe move this up, move this forward. And you can see that all the undulation looks the same. So there's two things we could do. One is to just simply move this wind deformer up or down just to get a slightly different type of undulation here, or we could just rotate this by hitting the R key and just rotate this 180 degrees along the y-axis. And now if we hit play, you can see that we have a slight variation in our undulation here. So I can move this up and you can see we have a nice bit of variety here. Okay, so let's duplicate the seaweed a few more times here. We'll shrink this down. Let's make another one, duplicate this. This is a little bit fatter. Move this forward in Z space. Maybe we'll rotate this 180 degrees so we get that variation. And let's make just one more, Command or Control click and drag. And maybe we'll move this one over here. And we'll just make sure that, we have that nice variation. We definitely don't want someone to look at this and see that like, oh, this looks exactly the same. They have the same animation or same deformation. So again, we can also adjust like the size here. So maybe the thicker seaweed will have bigger size. And then maybe some of these smaller ones go to the wind deformer size. And maybe this has, more undulation, more ripples by just making the size a little bit shorter. So now if I hit play, you can see we have slight variation here, looking pretty good. Maybe this one, since we made the wind size a little bit smaller, maybe we bring down the amplitude. Let me just enter 0.3. I think that's looking a little bit better, but that's looking really nice. Now, if we want to get back our crab and our fishbowl, what we can do is just deactivate the viewport solo. So I'll just simply click on that viewport solo button and boom, there is our crab, all happy to be amongst some seaweed. And now we can continue to adjust these seaweed, maybe twirl these up, move these back in Z space, like so. Maybe move the crab a little bit forward in Z space. So I'll just select the Z axis, move crab forward. And there we go, looking good. Now, let's clean up our object manager here. Let's select all of our seaweed and let's group them together. So Alt or Option G, and I'll double click on that new null and just name it seaweed group. And if we ever wanted to isolate this seaweed group again and say the sand again, we can go back into that solo menu and you'll notice that this doesn't work as expected because you'll see that we just had that null selected and none of the other objects in the hierarchy. So to solo objects with their hierarchy, you'll want to actually go to the button next to that solo button and choose Viewport Solo Hierarchy. And that will then include any hierarchy, any children of the objects that you just soloed. And now you can easily adjust the seaweed without all of those other objects in the scene in the way. And then again, when you're done, just click off the solo and you're back with all of your other objects. Everything is unsoloed. So the wind deformer is yet another powerful tool to not only help you model wavy elements, but allow you to apply procedural animation to an object.